Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Anish. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are dialing in the world. They told me yesterday we had over 1,000 people that tuned in to Enrich, which is absolutely phenomenal. Welcome to our panel today on the role of the Middle East in global energy security, affordability, and sustainability. We have three wonderful, esteemed guests on with us today. We're actually all dialing in from 4 different cities around the world. So if I could start with Mr. Fahad Al-Ajlan, who is the president of King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Center called CAPSARC. He was appointed as the president of CAPSARC in 2021. Prior to joining CAPSARC, Mr. Al-Ajlan held various senior roles across the government and corporate world, including in 2020, he was appointed as the head of the Circular Carbon Economy National Program in Saudi Arabia. Prior to that, the director of Hydrocarbon Sustainability Program at the Ministry of Energy. And prior to that, he had a very successful career with Saudi Aramco. Mr. Al-Ajlan is an engineer by training, but also is an MBA from Stanford. Welcome, Mr. Fahad Al-Ajlan. I know you're incredibly busy and in high demand on the energy circuit, so thank you for taking your morning out to be with us today. Mr. Ravi Suri, Senior Managing Director of Investments at AP Moller Capital. Mr. Ravi Suri is an experienced corporate finance and project finance banker with work experience across the entire capital market structure across geographies, including Asia, Australia, Middle East, Africa, Europe, North America, the whole world, essentially. He was previously worked with KPMG Lower Gulf as senior advisor and global head of our infrastructure finance team. Welcome, Ravi, from the UAE. And lastly, Miss Anvisha Thakkar, who's our global co-lead for climate change and decarbonization. She's also the partner and lead of renewable energy. Ms. Thakkar has over 20 years of extensive work experience in areas of policy, regulatory, strategic, and commercial advisory consulting, primarily in the renewable and new energy sectors. She has a diverse experience working across areas including electric vehicles, battery storage, rooftop, hybrid, wind power, and solar power too. Welcome, Ms. Thakkar, to the panel. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Now, to get things going, look, it could be argued that energy security is not a new topic, whereas energy transition is relatively new. I think the one thing that everybody on this panel and the audience can agree on is the importance of the Middle East to the topic in question. We had COP26 back in Glasgow. We had COP27 more recently in Sharm el-Sheikh. We had the huge energy conference in Abu Dhabi with ADIPEC. I'm not sure if any of you attended, where the super majors were in full force. The ministers of energies were also there too. Security and transition were central themes of all three events. So diving into our first question for the panel, energy transition and energy security, the dilemma or the opportunity of the century. Agree, disagree? Let's discuss. So being a gentleman, I would like to ask Ms. Thakkar to share her views on the initial question.
Thanks, Ami. I think, Middle East has a formidable, I would say, opportunity over here. It's obviously energy security is a key aspect that always needs to be looked at. And coming from my panels that we had yesterday, where we had insights being shared, I think one of the key messages that came out that nothing can trump energy security, first of all. So energy security definitely needs to be looked at, and every country and indeed every region has to look at its own bespoke solutions as they forge their way towards energy transition. Having said that, one cannot escape the whole climate agenda and the sustainability agenda, because the world, as they say very ominously, is at the brink of no going back as far as climate consequences are concerned. So there's absolutely no rolling back. Now, whether I see that as a threat or whether I see that as an opportunity, it's a very clear opportunity, and especially for countries within the Middle Eastern region. There's no denying how the countries are placed. If I look at where the whole energy sector is going globally in terms of the new energies coming in, clearly renewable energies are going to form the most important energy source globally, and maximum amount of investments are going there. If you look at the resources that is there in Middle East, there's a huge amount of barren land that is available. And solar, technologies like solar need a lot of land, and that is easily available. There's not enough, or the population is less dense, which also means that the availability is not an issue. You have very high resource potential. You have almost like 5 to 6 kilowatt hour being generated per square meter per day, which is extremely high insulation that can be achieved. And consequently, combined with your low cost, you are able to have the lowest cost power that is there. And Middle East has seen $1 to $2 dollars per kilowatt hour of solar energy itself. Then when you look at the next big frontier that we will go on energy transition, it's technologies like low carbon hydrogen. Why? Because of their ability to decarbonize the hard to abate sectors, because of their versatility, being able to come in and be used in a lot of applications, whether it is transport, whether it's refineries, whether it is industrial use such as fertilizers. And to make low carbon hydrogen, there are I would say, while there are a lot of ways of producing it, the two main are, producing it through renewable energy and electrolysis of water, which we call green hydrogen, or we use carbon capture along with, SMR technologies, which uses natural gas at the back of it, which is blue hydrogen. Now, whether it is green or whether it is blue, it is all essentially, I would say that the strength of the Middle East is in both these technologies, because you have abundant natural gas. Therefore, you can be one of the lowest cost producers, as far as blue hydrogen is concerned. When it comes to green hydrogen, almost 60 to 70% of its cost is actually renewable energy. And you've already proven that you can be the lowest cost producer of renewable energy. And therefore, you can be a very, very important producer, low cost producer of hydrogen or its derivatives like ammonia. And ammonia has a huge potential, or, hydrogen derivatives have a huge potential globally. You are a net energy exporter. You have the port infrastructure. So all in all, I would just summarize to say that whether it is the existing energy sources or whether it is the low carbon future, you're very attractively placed to actually leverage all your strengths to make this a big opportunity for you going forward.
Thank you. So you touched on investment, almost touching on investment strategies. I've got a question on that later on. We've actually lost your picture, Anvisha. I'm not sure if you can see it on your side. Moving on to, so thank you for those comments. I'll come on to investment strategies later on. Mr. Al-Ajlan, your views, dilemma or opportunity of the century? Energy transition and energy security. It's a very heavy loaded question. Sorry, folks.
So I think for people who are in energy, they always talk about the trilemma, which is energy security, energy affordability, and then climate change. And I think this is always what you try to do with your energy policies, try to balance all these three. And you cannot afford to trade one of those for the other. You need to balance all three of them. I think we've seen in the last 2 years the discussion around energy security. We've seen this actually start before the Russia-Ukraine conflict back in September of last year, in the lead up to Glasgow and COP26. We've seen shortages of energy, spikes in energy prices, and so that has brought in a lot more emphasis on energy security. I think when we're talking about climate change, we've seen that this year there has been less emphasis, and you can see this in the mood and discussion happening in Sharm el-Sheikh at COP27. However, I think when we're talking about the opportunities, I think there will be a lot of opportunities within this energy transition, both energy security, climate change, when we talk about clean tech, but also I think affordability. Unfortunately, I think the previous winners or the current winners of this energy, race will continue to be the winners in the future. So, I mean, we speak about the Middle East as a monolith. It's not. We have energy exporter or oil exporter, and we have energy importer. And I think even within the energy exporter, we're not going to see all of them being winners. We're seeing much more efforts in Saudi Arabia and UAE. You're seeing a lot of opportunities being taken advantage of during the energy transition, whether this is renewable, hydrogen, industrial investment. But these countries have the fiscal space, they have the governance, they have the stability to be able to attract investment, to be able to be relied on as a secure energy supplier. I think when we look at just resources, there are other countries within the region, but I'll just maybe use Venezuela as an example. Venezuela, when it comes to oil reserve, for example, is the largest or one of the largest, reserve holders. That doesn't mean that oil production continue to flow. And I think we need to look at the soft issues, the governance, the financial market, the investment, the fiscal space that are available for countries to look at where the next opportunities will be. And I think I see them in Saudi Arabia, I see them in UAE, I see them in Qatar, and maybe a little bit in Egypt and Jordan. But other countries, I don't think there will be a lot of opportunities. And I think there will be a lot of people who will suffer, regardless of their natural endowment, whether on the hydrocarbon side or on the renewable side.
Thank you. You actually raised an interesting point on this topic about what is energy security. I'll come to that question in a second. Ravi, we've got you back. Do you have anything to add to the topic of dilemma or opportunity of the century, transition and security?
The two are inclusive. They are not exclusive. So there is no dilemma. The energy transition is going to be your energy security. You can't isolate the two. So people who can do both, who can look at from the existing sources that they have, but also implement transition for the future to ensure that can be driven down, ultimately have both security and will have both transition. So the two go hand in hand with each other. And I don't think they are exclusive, and I don't think there's any dilemma. And I think that's where the Middle East is scoring, because they are looking at both energy transition as an opportunity for security.
I think we've lost you again, Ravi.
I said the Middle East is looking at energy transition as an opportunity and ultimately also as a security as they transition through to low-cost production. We can talk about what the advantages of the Middle East are, and I can talk about that later. But just to stay focused to your question is that I don't see these as two different. They're similar. The opportunity and for the transition is the energy security.
Excellent. So I guess if we conclude, if we could bring all those comments together, we're almost saying that it's two sides of the same coin. I don't know how to balance that with your trilemma. Fahad, that kind of threw me off. I'll figure that out before we finish. Fahad, you made a comment that I thought was interesting. Just if I could get your views on this before we move on to specifically the Middle East. There seems to be a predominant narrative that links the oil supply as the only component of energy security. If you remember, years ago, we used to speak about piracy, and then there was cyber. In your view, is there a holistic, long-term approach to this narrative, if you will, on how we should be talking about energy security? If you could spend a couple of minutes or share your views on that.
Sure. I mean, regardless of the threat, are we talking about cyber, physical attack, if we're talking about, using energy as a weapon, I think the lesson, and this is, established in the last 40, 50 years, is that to be a reliable energy supplier and one that partners are looking to work with, you need to invest beyond just, full production capacity. You need to have redundancy, you need to have reliability, you need to have extra capacity. And I think this has been ignored in the past, but the countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait has invested beyond their production limit. If you go today to Saudi Arabia, they're producing around 10.5, 10.6 million barrel per day. They have almost an extra 2 million barrel per day capacity. That takes, billions of dollars in investment. And Saudi Arabia and similarly UAE and Kuwait are doing it. It's a sound investment. It might not, look like a sound investment, but it is, because I think it gives you this reliability and gives you this energy security, not as, a nation, but also globally. We've done, our analysis and research looking into the value of spare capacity to the world. And the OPEC spare capacity alone provides almost $200 to $500 billion of, additional GDP globally, because it reduces, energy volatility and energy prices. And so that's part of the investment. I think, however, we need to look at it in the, big geopolitical scene. And I think, there is a quote attributed to President Truman of the US saying that, a recession is when your neighbor loses their job. It's a depression when you lose your job. And I think that's what we have seen in the past. When we've seen in the past that the global narrative, again, pivoting to the global north, to the Western world, is that when Europe is faced with a security threat, energy supply crisis, it's a global energy supply crisis. But when there is an attack on an oil facility in Saudi Arabia that actually helps in maintaining the energy reliability, it's not addressed in the same global narrative. And I think that's unfortunate, because I think, again, I go back to that point. Countries like Saudi, UAE, Kuwait invested a lot of money, and they're doing it not only with their goodness of their heart, they see the value globally, but they also see the value to themselves being, a reliable energy supplier. If you look at, for example, what happened in 2011 when the tsunami hit, Japan, Saudi, by having, storage just of Japan on Okinawa, helped in stabilizing the situation in Japan following the tsunami and the earthquake. And for me, that's how we should talk about energy, supply, how we should talk about energy security. Those threats will continue, whether we're talking about cyber, physical, all kind of threats will continue. What we need is make sure that we build reliability in the global energy supply. We make sure we have redundancy. And again, I think what, for example, China and India are doing is very smart by diversifying their energy supply. And if you go and see India's and China's import, they don't go over a certain, threshold for each country. Even though they can, they just think of it as part of their energy security.
Thanks. So this is a perfect segue into what I wanted to speak about next, honing in on the Middle East specifically, and the Middle East retaining its influence in the global energy space. I think, Fahad, you just touched on some of those topics there. What I'd like to focus on are, can the Middle East continue to retain its influence in the global energy space? What would be the enablers? What could we possibly see as limiting this influence? And some of the unique advantages that we think the Middle East have in retaining that influence in the global energy space. I do have a question afterwards on the investment strategy. So anything other than investment, I'd like to open that up to the panel. And Visha, if I could go to you first, please. Your views. Retaining Middle East influence.
Sure. And am I audible and visible? Now, I'm really sorry about what happened earlier.
No, you are audible and visible.
Okay, great. So I think I have already covered one aspect of it, Sami, on the dominance that the natural dominance that Middle East has, as far as the new energies are concerned, such as and the most visible and the most I would say talked about and invested opportunity over there is the low carbon hydrogen, where Middle East is positioned very well to emerge as the lowest cost producer. And indeed, we are seeing that there are projects being announced. There's government to government MOUs. There are projects being announced with corporates, from Japan, from Germany, from Korea, which is coming into the Middle East, where there are investments coming in ammonia projects in Middle East, from where ammonia, would get transported by these off-takers in the importing countries. So we are already seeing Middle East take I would say, running. They've hit the ground running as far as the new energy space is concerned. I would like to touch a bit upon the challenges very briefly. I think the biggest challenge is the global competition, where while they may not have been the prime movers, we see countries like US now majorly gearing up. As you may be aware, that there's the Inflation Reduction Act that was, recently, launched in the US, and what that is going to make is going to make US one of the probably the lowest cost producer of low carbon hydrogen, because of the amount of policy incentives that is being given, which can almost be like $3 per kg if you are completely green, which is huge, because you're really talking about green hydrogen costs between $3 to $4. So that's a huge amount of subsidization. So if US plans to enter the export market, although their domestic requirement is pretty huge. So we have to see, what this means in terms of US's play in the global markets, and a lot will emerge over the decade. But if countries like US come in, there can be a lot of competition also from other countries like Chile, for example, or Morocco, which are all gearing up to go, majorly into the international scene. The other challenge is the point that Fahad made about diversification, and I just want to expand that point. I think many countries will remain very conscious, and perhaps more than India, China, we would have more countries entering the bandwagon on trying to diversify their energy, sources. And the same would apply to new energies as well, because, having learned from the whole current geopolitical crisis, this would be one of the main, strategies as far as energy is concerned that countries will follow. And therefore, there is likely to be considerable competition for the Middle East as we move forward.
Thank you, Anvisha. Ravi, anything around the unique advantages in the Middle East to retain that influence?
So yes, I'd like to add a few points here. I think there are 5 things going in the favor of the Middle East, which no country in the world can match. And I think that the Middle East will be the undisputed leader in the next 10 to 15 years in this energy transition. Now, why do I say that? And what are the 5 things which the Middle East has, which the other countries don't have? And this again comes back to the fundamental point which I said, that energy transition and energy security are linked. So the first thing is, we all know that the Middle East has been abundant in oil and has been abundant in gas, and that will remain. And gas and oil will be here to stay. It's not going to disappear, but at the same time, it's going to reduce. But the Middle East will control that, and the Middle East has enough oil and gas reserves for the next 15, 20 years. A lot of other countries don't have that. The second thing which the Middle East has is very good is sun. Whenever I think of the Middle East, I think of the Beatles song, "Here Comes the Sun." Right? Now, the next 20 years, the Middle East is going to lead because of the sun, not because of the oil, because of the sun. And why do I say that? Anvisha touched on it. There are certain parts of solar, of course, which we have, the Middle East has done very well. The largest scale solar parks are here. There's going to be battery storage, so they're going to transition to base load. But it's also in elements of the hydrogen chain where the Middle East can play a big role. Now, hydrogen is a bit of a hype, right? At the end of the day, not every element of the hydrogen chain is going to work. But there are certain elements which are going to work, which is the transition and the use of ammonia and transport of green ammonia, and then ultimately used for transport or used for steel, which is where Saudi has led the way. And costs will come down. So the sun will be used, and it will harness and show the Middle East the way. The third and the most important is capital. And we can talk about it later. But there is no amount of capital anywhere available in the world as there is in the Middle East, whether it is equity, whether it is debt, or whether it is sovereign wealth funds. The fourth and the most important one is also policy and vision. The Middle East has rulers who have vision, they implement, they go about flawless planning, and they execute it very well. We've seen the transformation. I mean, I used to work for GE Capital, and they had a slogan called in GE, imagination at work. Frankly, honestly, imagination is at work in the Middle East. If you see the transformation of Saudi, see the transformation of Dubai, Abu Dhabi, imagination is at work. I don't think there is any other country in the world where imagination is at work as it is in the Middle East. And the fifth point, which is also a game changer with the Middle East, is moving towards is attracting intellectual capital and IT and development. I mean, there's a lot of interest going on in universities for pure research, AI, cybersecurity, metaverse. So a lot of technology development, a lot of research and development is also being done here. Now, if you have these 5 pillars, you're invincible. And we can go around the horn and see if any other country or any other region in the world has all 5 pillars. I don't see that. So that's why I feel that the Middle East will rule in the next 10 to 20 years in the energy transition space.
Very, very positive outlook from Ravi. Fahad, anything to add to what Anvisha and Ravi have said around the Middle East retaining its influence?
So I think maybe just to add to what they covered it pretty well, but I'll just add 2 points. First is the long-term vision and planning. Saudi announced their intention to go for their maximum sustainable capacity for oil production from 12 to 13 million. Not this year, not last year. This was in April and May 2020, when WTI hit negative prices when we were in the midst of COVID. And I think you have this long-term vision and long-term, outlook that is, going beyond just, the short term, which is driven by commercial interest and business interest. The second, I think, and I agree with Anvisha on the Inflation Reduction Act, the potential. However, I think the potential is there when it comes to subsidy. However, I think the issue that needs to be is that streamlining regulation and permitting. If a project continue to take 5 to 6 years for permitting, it doesn't matter what kind of incentive you have. It's not going to happen. And so for me, when I see that, Germany is facing in 2020, resistance to building an LNG terminal during an energy crisis, it makes me a little bit sober up. And yes, maybe today in 2022, they can manage it. But maybe in 2024, they cannot manage it. And if you hear, the discussion from European companies that are investing in renewable, their biggest issue is not investment, not capital, not projects. It's permitting. And unless you have that, it's going to take a while. I think in Saudi and UAE, things can be slow a little bit at the beginning, and we've seen this with solar. But once it starts moving, it has a lot of momentum. It's helped by also low population density, centralized decision making. And so that might not help you at the beginning, but it helps you in the long term.
So agreeing with Ravi there then on the leadership and vision, big factor in retaining the influence of the Middle East. So I think you kind of touched on it briefly before, all three of you, in fact, on the investment strategies of the Middle East players in conventional and renewable areas. Where should we be putting, or where should the Middle East players be putting their investment? I mean, Ravi spoke about sun, solar, and hydrogen. Do you want to add anything else on the investment strategies? And I'd like to, after that, Ravi, you touched upon the availability of, because these projects need money, right? The availability of finance, cost of finance. None of you mentioned that as being a constraint to these investments in the Middle East. So I'd be interested to hear your views on that. So firstly, investment strategies. Where should the Middle East players be focusing when it comes to conventional and renewable energy? Back to you, Anvisha.
Thanks, Sami. And I think I like the way you worded that question, that where should they be placing their bets? Because again, I think...
in your humble opinion, where should they be?
No, because it actually goes back to the basics of the energy trilemma, which is around affordability, sustainability, and security at the end of the day. And I think that the investment strategies need to keep in mind all the three as we move forward. Bearing in mind, and you touched upon capital, that investors across the MENA region are also very conscious of the ESG strategies and the ESG metrics of the investee companies. So bearing this in mind, I would say that when planning investment strategies, I would say that I'm looking at energy security being at the center. So definitely oil and gas investments will continue. And indeed, if you look at the major utilities in Middle East, there is a good weightage towards continuing investments in oil and gas, which is absolutely fine. But definitely, I am seeing, and I would like to see more of renewable energy investments also coming in, because as I said, whether it is the investor expectations, you are hosts, to the next COP, which is next year. So, I'm sure that corporates need to lay out their strategies and come up with very convincing plans of how they're actually going to move towards sustainability. Many countries in the Middle East, whether it is Saudi Arabia, UAE, Oman, they have already, laid out their net zero strategies, whether it's in 2050 or 60. So given that, the investment strategies of utilities will have to and are already starting to focus on new energies, whether it's renewables, whether it's low carbon hydrogen, green or blue, whether it's carbon capture, because Middle Eastern is in a position to leverage this technology like perhaps no other region because of the low cost, gas that you have. So you can produce a low cost, blue hydrogen. The other interesting thing that I noted, especially in Saudi Arabia and Oman, is investments in nature-based solutions, which I think is fantastic, not only for the company, for this to act as natural carbon sinks, but also for the whole, the ecology and the whole region as such. So that's another investment theme that I feel that the region should focus on, which is nature-based solutions. And there are many innovations that we are seeing but maybe we can talk about innovations a bit later, but I do see investments that will be required in a lot of innovative technologies, which we are seeing, coming up in the Middle East and being talked about in the Middle East.
Hold that thought on innovation. I do have a question for you on innovation. Back to you, Fahad. Now, I know CAPSARC, I have to remind the audience, because there's quite a lot of you out there, that CAPSARC is a non-for-profit think tank, so it doesn't represent any of the governments per se. However, Fahad, if I may ask you, the investment strategies of the key Middle Eastern players in your view within the conventional renewable energy space, where do you think they should be focusing their investment?
So thank you for the reminder. I think that's a good thing just to have it, the disclaimer before I say anything about investment. I think oil and gas will continue to be the winner, to be honest. I see, what is happening globally, and I think we're going to see, tight supply for the forthcoming, 8 years at least. I think on the renewable, I think given the way that, the contracting is happening, this is not an open market for electricity. It's a very regulated market. That margins for renewable projects will continue to be handsome, especially if debt is cheap, if you can leverage your projects, have the right financial setup, then it would continue. In a era of increasing interest rate, not sure if this is going to be permanent or temporary, but this might be challenged. I think hydrogen, given that it's going to be exported, is going to benefit from investment from global oil price, global energy prices. And I think we're seeing global energy prices being, I think, on the rise. And I expect that, hydrogen projects are going, whether we're talking about, blue hydrogen, green hydrogen, I think all of them will be attractive when it comes, to returns.
Excellent. Thank you. So a lot of, there's actually quite a lot of plays that you both mentioned then. Ravi, I know this is your baby. The availability of finance, the cost of finance, possibly a constraint with all of these projects. We need to focus, right? Your views, please, Ravi.
Yeah, so just before we get into the finance, and I'll answer that question, I think it's very important that we look at the economic viability of these projects. So if you need to get finance, economic viability is important. So where is the economic viability right now in the Middle East? It's in solar. Large-scale solar. It's going to tend towards hydrogen, but only certain elements of the hydrogen chain, especially the green ammonia bit. Hydrogen to power is a bit down the line. Carbon capture and all is a bit down the line. So trying to get finance for that is going to be challenging and probably should not be focused on. But waste to energy is a very growing field in the Middle East, and it also fits in with the net circular economy and the march to net zero. Now, coming back to finance, okay, let me be very clear. There is no dearth of finance. Whether you do limited recourse project financing, or whether you do corporate balance sheet financing, or whether you do financing from the sovereign wealth funds who want to put in the money, there is no dearth. There is capital available, but capital doesn't flow. And why? Capital doesn't flow because risks are not correctly mitigated. And most of these projects don't get the money because the risk allocation is not to the right party to take it. If you get the risk allocation correct, and if you have the economic viability teed up, which is what I explained earlier, you will get the finance. They will come from commercial banks, they will come from sovereign wealth funds, they will come from private equity, they will come from bonds, they will come from export credit agencies. So if you focus on the risk mitigation, you will get it right, you'll get the financing. Now, one challenge which we are facing in the next 10 years, which we did not face in the previous 10 years, is technology risk, right? Many of these have got scale-up risk issues, and many of them have got challenges on technology. Project finance as a tool, which has been very, very effectively used in the Middle East, has been very well designed for construction risk mitigation, political risk mitigation. It's not been designed for technology risk mitigation. So you need that layer added. If you look at the hydrogen chain, it follows a great extent the LNG chain in terms of its risk mitigation. But there's a technology element. Now, banks probably will not take that. But if you can get an insurance, if you can get in the concept of efficacy insurance, where insurance takes that technology risk, wraps it for the bank, that risk is also mitigated. So in a nutshell, capital is available, mitigate the risk correctly, and use insurance to mitigate your technology risk, and the money will flow into these projects, provided the economic viability is ascertained from day one.
Thank you, Ravi. That kind of leads me into my next question. I know I said hold that thought, Anvisha, on innovation, and almost you could almost argue that what Ravi was speaking about is an innovative approach to finance. Almost, there's a saying that that crisis is the mother of all innovation. I don't know who said it. It's a really good saying, though. And I'm just wondering, in your views, all of you, are we seeing substantial innovation around the new energy space in the region? Are we seeing enough innovation? What types of innovation are we seeing? Or what types of innovation are we missing? If I could go to Fahad, please, on that initial question.
Thank you, Sami. I think that there is a lot of innovation that's happening. I can speak about it from, the circular carbon economy, a program that we're working with many stakeholders. So we're working with the Ministry of Energy, we're working with the Ministry of Industry, but also I think research institutions such as KAUST and King Fahd University. We're working with Aramco and SABIC and so on. So we're seeing quite a bit of innovation when it comes to new technology for carbon capture, when it comes to, a way of storing CO2 below ground. We're seeing also a lot of innovation when it comes to geothermal energy. And also when it comes to just, looking at current uses of energy. SABIC is looking at a lot of innovation when it comes to their products, but also their processes to reduce their emissions and so on. So I think we're seeing a lot of innovation when it comes, especially on the, clean energy part. KAUST is doing a lot of, wonderful innovation when it comes to material, when it comes to, PV for solar. So we're seeing quite a lot of innovation within Saudi Arabia. I think, the point that Ravi made about de-risking project is important. And we've seen it. Sometimes it takes a lot longer than what we would like to see it. And that happens, especially for some of these projects that we're talking in the billions of dollars. I think what we need is a way of quite, fastly, expediting these processes. So going from pilot to, a small scale project into a large scale project. And I think that's a difficult challenge, not only in the Middle East and Saudi Arabia specifically, but also globally. However, I think without it makes the ambition that we have, difficult to achieve. Not in 2030. I'm talking about, the technology that is needed beyond 2030. I think for 2030, almost all the technology is there. I think what happens next is where we need a lot more innovation.
Thank you. Anvisha, I know innovation is close to your heart, something you were bursting to say something about earlier.
Yes. I was, and I'm so glad that Ravi and Vahad set the context so well. I would actually like to divide innovation into two aspects. One is what we understand by innovation, which is innovation in core technology, right? How do you do things bigger, better, faster, right? The second is innovation in your mindset. Which I would label under transformation, because that's about people's processes, technology, et cetera, et cetera. Now, just to touch upon first on the technology side, the innovation in technology, as Fahad said, I think there's a lot of work, that's happening. Israel is the center of innovation, and the best technologies out there for solar, maintenance, better performance, for electrolyzer, the highest efficiency. One of the highest efficiencies that we are seeing is technologies coming out of Israel. So definitely, as far as core technologies are concerned, there is a lot of innovation that is happening. But there are two aspects to this that I would like to briefly touch upon. I think the question is it enough? Because as Middle East, you contribute almost, if I'm not mistaken, 5 to 6% of the global GDP. But the R&D spend is just about 1%. So given the kind of human, capital, intellectual capital, and Middle East invented coffee, and I'm very thankful to them for that. I mean, from what I understand, so the kind of first mover advantage that you have had on R&D, I think that there's a lot more that can be done. Second, on private sector participation in R&D. A lot of R&D in Middle East is led by the government, while a lot of other countries like China, US, you have private sector spending almost double or maybe 4 times what the government spends on R&D. But in Middle East, the share of private sector is very small. It's just about 5%. If I may hazard a number here, I could be wrong over there. So I think, how do we co-opt the private sector and help them come in on R&D is one of the big aspects. Second, I talked about transformation. And the limited point over there is how do you increase your agility to, in terms of your business approach, people, processes. The business approach, I think, the Middle East has taken a lead, whether it's converting hydrogen to ammonia, or Ravi touched upon a very important aspect, which is steel. There's going to be such a big global demand for green steel because of a lot of, EU is a key importer. There is carbon border adjustment mechanism, which also, taxes the carbon that is inherent, that's embodied in that product. So if Middle East is going to use their low carbon hydrogen, and you are leaders in DRI based steel making, and which is very amenable to hydrogen technology. So if you can use your low carbon hydrogen to produce steel and then export the steel, your dominance is not only in energy, but it is in products that are derived from that low carbon hydrogen or low carbon energy. And we're already seeing that. We're already seeing those projects being announced, the green steel projects being announced in Middle East. So in terms of approach, you've already taken the leadership as far as business approach is concerned. But I would say that more needs to be done in supply chain. How do you work with your vendors? How do you work with your consumers in energy transition? How do you look at adaptation, because it's a region which is very susceptible to climate disasters? Is there enough innovation, actually happening around, adaptation? These are some of the aspects, and people, are in organizations investing enough in building human capital and capability around sustainability? These are the 2-3 areas where I would see more innovation and approach. Thank you.
Ravi, thank you, Anvisha. Ravi, I'd like to touch on a point that Anvisha just mentioned, co-opting the private sector. How do we do it? Any ideas?
I'll let me just share my thoughts. I'll give you the answer to that, but just let me add something on innovation, right?
Please.
And where does the Middle East stack up in innovation, right? There are, to my mind, three elements of innovation. There are three elements. One is process innovation, the other is cost innovation, and the third is product innovation, right? In terms of process innovation, the Middle East leads the way. You know, whether you see the way they manage the airlines, whether you see the way they do the efficiency, so that innovation is at work in the Middle East. That innovation is linked to imagination, which I said before. The second is cost innovation, right? If you see the way the solar projects have been set up, the economies of scale which have been set up, cost innovation is at play. The Middle East does everything big, the biggest in the world. Number one in the world for this, number one in the world for that, largest solar parks, largest waste to energy. Through that comes your cost innovation. So the Middle East works there. Now, where is it that it needs to work, and which is where it's going to be in the fifth pillar, which I said in my earlier statement, is in product innovation and R&D. And in that, the Middle East is making waves and moving forward. Now, the advantage is, in certain countries, you need the private sector to do it. Or in the Middle East, you can get the private sector to do it, but the government policies are so strong, government institutions are so strong that the government is funding a lot of these innovations. I mean, if you look at what is happening in the Middle East, there's transformation in eco-centers taking place between university, governments, and private sector. People are putting in effort into develop the metaverse. There's a lot of work being done in AI. So universities are being set up here now for research and development, jointly with the private sector and the government. But the government is so strong here in its vision, in its support and its money, that unlike other countries, you don't really need the private sector to come to the forefront. Not that it won't, but this combination of the government supporting and private sector supporting is again one of the strongest in the world in the Middle East. And that's why I feel that's the trend which needs to come. To the point which Anvisha said, what is it the Middle East needs to do? It's doing process, it's doing cost innovation very well. It needs to do product and basic R&D, and that will come through this mechanism.
And I guess, thank you, Ravi. And going back to your previous point, we shouldn't underestimate the need to attract the talent to the region that drives all three of your pillars on innovation. So coming back to government here, I'm just keeping an eye on time. I did want to give some questions and answers to the audience. We still have around 10 minutes left. Coming back to governments. Now, are we seeing adequate planning and credible policy actions on the part of the government in the region, specifically around NDCs, the national determined contribution of these governments? There are people asking, is climate adoption a key issue in the Middle East? Now, some of you may laugh at that, but there are people that are still asking that question. Is it really getting adequate attention or the right level of attention? Is there a sense of urgency in the Middle East like there is everywhere else? Incredibly loaded questions, but I'd like to hear your views on that, please. If I could start with you, Mr. Lajlan. Tfadal.
Sure. On the NDCs, I think there is a lot of attention that's being given, but again, it varies by country. I think we've actually published the research looking at the Gulf countries, especially, and how they are on their ways in implementing their NDCs. And so you can look at our website. I would say the UAE and Saudi are very clear on their NDCs and how they will implement them. I think for some other countries that it's a little bit vaguer. On the climate adaptation, I think there is a lot of attention being given. I think when we think of Saudi Arabia or the Middle East, we don't think of environment. We think, but this is, an area that's 1 or 2 generations removed from being, living in nature and depending on nature for their food, for their security, for their livelihood. And there is a lot of attention being given. It might not be visible, but I think if you're looking at Saudi Arabia, for example, deciding to designate a third of their land as nature reserve, the ambition to plant 10 billion trees, I think these are, very ambitious objectives. But also there is, on the climate adaptation, there is a renewed focus around, efficiency, making sure that you're looking at, especially in this part of the world, high efficient air conditioning, desalination, what would be the impact, especially of extended drought, extended heat waves. There is a lot of work being done. I think, especially when it comes to food security, there is a lot of being done. However, it's not enough. I think, this is a global challenge, and whatever the countries do, they need to address it, through a global, cooperation rather than, each country buy for itself.
Anvi, thank you. Fahad. And Visha, your thoughts, please. Sense of urgency. Is there enough?
So I would say the sense of urgency is not enough with any country in any region in the world. And that has been underlined at COP itself, that all countries need to do more because if we combine the conditional and the unconditional NDCs of all the countries, we will achieve an emission reduction of only about 10% by 2030. And what is required as per the latest emissions gap report is a 45% reduction of emissions to prevent climate catastrophe to happen. So sorry to sound ominous, but actually the report is called the closing window. So that so it's not about the Middle East, it's about the world. But having said that, Middle East does have, a significantly high per capita emissions. And to that extent, if I really look at it, few countries have announced net zero, which I mentioned before. But if you look at the large number of countries in the region, there is, maybe 7 to 14% kind of, carbon emission reduction that has been announced in 2030. And if I'm talking about a 45% that needs to be achieved globally together. So definitely we all need to do more, including Middle East. Thank you.
Team game, team sport is the message that I'm hearing. Ravi, any comments on the sense of it?
The Middle East is very broad, so you can't paint it in one brush. But let me share with you some thoughts on the urgency. So first of all, I would be very hesitant to draw any conclusions of the Middle East from the COP26 meeting. Because when people have a climate change meeting and they fly 400 private jets into COP, okay, I will not take anything which COP says seriously. Now, the Middle East does work quietly, but they work silently, right? And that's why probably the world doesn't see it. But there's a lot of activity going on. The energy transition already started a long time ago with large-scale solar, with the kind of stuff which has been put up here. The Middle East had oil. The Middle East had gas. Why did they implement in solar? They had foresight. Why are they implementing in hydrogen now? Because they have foresight. The largest waste-to-energy project in the world is set up in Dubai. IEA has said that if they need to meet the temperature control of 1.5 degrees, waste-to-energy needs to grow. So, yes, there's a lot being done. Yes, more needs to be done. But to say that there is no urgency here is not correct, number one. Number two, different parts of the Middle East are in a different journey. Right, Saudi and the UAE lead the way, but others follow. So every country needs to do more. But I think the Middle East is doing its fair bit and will continue to do it. As I said, on the 5 pillars, in the next 10 years, the Middle East will lead. Now, why will it lead? And why am I saying it so confidently? Is because they will lead it from a profit position point of view. They will drive costs down because of the innovation parameters that they have. They will drive it down because they have finance. And they'll make it a business proposition which makes sense for climate and for the economies. And that's where the winners will lie in the next 10 years.
Thank you. Thank you, Ravi. I'd just like to remind the audience that our panel is all being done virtually, and we haven't left the chairs in our offices. Closing 5 minutes. I did promise that we would have some questions and answers. So I'm just looking at my screen here at the team to share any of the questions that are coming through. So technical team, if you could share with me any of the questions that are coming through for our panel. We have one here. We can't go through any panel these days without mentioning the war in Ukraine. So, question for our panel. Does the Ukraine war positively or negatively alter the course of decarbonization globally and in the Middle East? And Visha, you first, please, if I may.
I'm actually going to deflect this question to Ravi because having heard his views, I would be very keen to myself hear his answers. So Ravi, why don't you go for that?
I'll tell you what the Ukraine war does for everyone from an energy security. It shows you, A, the importance of gas, right? And gas as a transition fuel continues to stay. But what it does.
We've lost you, Ravi. I'm not sure if that's because somebody didn't like the answer or it's technology based. Are you there, Ravi? No, I think we've lost Ravi. So I don't know. I mean, that was a good deflection. And Visha, Fahad, I'm not sure if you want.
Let me come in on my view.
Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, no, I'll come in. So I think the answer remains the same, whether it is Middle East or any other region. And throughout the enriched day one session that we have yesterday, this was one of the key questions being debated. And I'll tell you the outcome from that, or the summary of that. The summary of that is that it is definitely going to increase the polarization, the energy security aspects. So while the dialogue maybe 2 years back was all about renewables and energy transition, and coal, gas were kind of being treated a bit, especially coal, like poor cousins, the non-glamorous cousins, the dialogue has noticeably shifted globally towards saying that fossil fuels will be a mainstay, but we need to make them low carbon. So if coal is not low carbon, how do we make it low carbon? Gas is already low carbon. So how do we use it to the best, in the best way to bring in more renewables? So it's about coupling what we have with what needs to kind of come in. So in a way, the decarbonization agenda will remain, but I think the clarion call for let's not do fossil fuels, etc., is dying down. And it's more about a systems approach, where you look at emissions from an overall perspective and don't do this technology selection and see that how do we best bring it all together and aim towards an overall emission reduction in the system.
Thank you. I go back to the saying that, I don't know who said it, that a crisis is the mother of innovation. I'm getting a red light flashing here. We have 2 minutes left. I think we got excited with our questions, and obviously the Ukraine question derailed everybody. If I may ask my esteemed guests to give us a 30-second conclusion, concluding comments on the next 10 years of energy security in the Middle East. 30 seconds each. Mr. Al-Ajlan, if I could begin with you, sir.
Yeah, I think the Middle East is going to become more important because of this discussion around energy security. But I think we're also going to see it much more pronounced in geopolitical tension between China and the US, Europe and Russia. And I think we're going to be looking at discussion between energy security and energy affordability. The cost of energy is going to go up.
Thank you. Ravi, your concluding comments, please. I think we've lost Ravi again. I started as a gentleman. I wanted to finish as a gentleman. And Visha, if I could give you the last words, please. Concluding comments on the next 10 years of energy security.
So I mean, the energy security, I think Middle East is going to continue playing a very dominant role, as far as low carbon fuels are concerned, whether it is gas on oil and gas, or whether it is new technologies like hydrogen. And I think you will be a formidable force to watch out for.
Thank you. Thank you. Our time is up. I'd like to thank you, Mr. Fahad Al-Ajlan, and Miss Anvisha Thacker, and also Ravi, who we lost there at the end. Fantastic panel. I certainly learned a lot. I'd like you all to enjoy the rest of the Enrich conference. And I would remind everybody to go online and Google the essay that Fahad, you spoke about, which is available on the CAPSARC website for public consumption. Is that right?
That's true. Thank you, Sami.
Thank you all. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of the conference. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.